I am Ryan McKnight, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 61 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Sunday, August 6th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Next week, we're going to be back on the regular schedule, but this is the episode that I promised you would come out a couple of days later than regular because of the Sunstone Symposium. On this week's episode, we're going to cover the first 3 months of 1840, when Joe met with the United States Congressional Committee to petition them for redress for what the Saints had suffered in Missouri. The meeting met every day over a week's time and increasingly became more skeptical with each day of discussion with Joe. Finally, a resident of Missouri makes it to the meeting to give his side of the conflict, and the committee resolves that Missouri should handle Missouri's problems. After that, we have a bit of a longer Mormon Leaks Minute segment with correspondent Ryan McKnight of Mormon Leaks to discuss a treasure trove of 37 leaked documents from Bruce R. McConkie's unpublished personal writings. And of course, patrons will get an extra segment discussing McConkie's hatred of evolution. Let's get into it. A few episodes ago, we suspended the historical timeline. We did this so that I could invite my research partner, Cody Nacconi of the Silly Rabbits podcast, onto the show for an in-depth discussion of the Smith entheogen theory ramping up for Sunstone. Of course, the previous episode was a wrap-up of Sunstone, where Marie and I discussed some of the presentations, including the presentation that Cody and I did on the Smith entheogen theory. And then we talked about some of the other fun stuff that Marie and I did while we were in Utah, because we were there for a couple of days after Sunstone, so we could go to the Book of Mormon on Broadway. At the end of this episode, I'll add a few concluding thoughts now that I've had time to, kind of process and reconnect with some of the people that I met at Sunstone. But now it's finally time to jump back into our historical timeline to see what Joe and friends are up to lately. When we were last talking about the Joseph Smith and his whole company, the Quorum of the 12 were slowly making their way towards the East Coast to board a ship bound for England, where they would set up shop for over a year to proselyte to the unwashed Europeans hungry for the Mormon Jesus in their lives. At this time, Joe, Rigdon, Pistolpack, and Porter Rockwell, and Elias Higbee began their journey for Washington, D.C. to petition the government for redress for what the Saints suffered during their time living in Missouri, prior to being removed at the hands of the mob armed with a Mormon extermination order. Mob, militia. We'll get into it. During this journey, Orson Pratt accompanied Joe, and he listened to a number of lectures that Joe gave on his own history as well as the history of the Book of Mormon, which Pratt later compiled into a pamphlet to be printed in Edinburgh, titled, quote, "An Interesting Account of Several Remarkable Visions," end quote. This booklet served as some of the foundation for the Joseph Smith history, which would be printed in the newly circulating Times and Seasons in a few years' time. After reading through that pamphlet for patrons only, we discussed Joe meeting with the President of the United States, Martin Van Buren, who promptly turned Joe out of the White House once he learned of Joe's reasons for calling the meeting. The POTUS was worried about the new election cycle and knew that if he gave Mormons anything, that he would come into contact with the whole state of Missouri and, of course, lose their votes. Once again, politics gets in the way of making a moral decision. After this meeting, Joe, Rigdon, and Higbee were stuck in Washington, D.C., waiting for a meeting with Congress to attempt to go over the president's head, that good old checks and balances doctrine. So this helping of milk gets us ready to chomp into some meat. Let's get into the beginning of 1840.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
Some interesting developments occurred during the first month of 1840. Joe didn't want the meeting with Congress to go as unfortunately for him as had the meeting with President Van Buren, so he decided to get some things in order. In a letter he sent right after his meeting with the president, he directly petitioned some of the leaders of the Mormon Church to make affidavits describing what they'd experienced in Missouri at the hands of the militia. They were making any possible argument they could to Congress that their constitutional rights had been violated, all in hopes that the government would understand the plight of the Mormons and take pity on them in the form of a huge monetary payment. So here's the line from Joe's letter, and this is dated December 7th, 1839, and it was sent to the church in Commerce, Illinois. I'm reading this from page 43 of the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Source and Text Critical Edition. Quote, "We want you to assist us now, and also to forward us your certificates that you hold for lands in Missouri, your claims to preemption rights, and affidavits to prove that soldiers were quartered on us and in our houses without our consent or any special act of law for that purpose, contrary to the Constitution of the United States. We think Brother Ripley and others will recollect circumstances and facts relative to this matter. You will also recollect the circumstances of Brother Joseph and others being refused the privileges of habeas corpus by the authorities of Missouri. These facts must be authenticated by affidavits. Let any particular transaction of the outrages in Missouri that can be sworn to by the sufferers or those who are eyewitnesses to the facts be sent, specifying the particulars. Have the evidence bona fide to the point." End quote. So these, of course, the trusted Mormon leaders were happy to oblige with this request to forward Joe's mission in petitioning the government for redress. Here are a few excerpts from some of the subsequent pages in the History of the Church, Vogel edition. Quote, "I, Simeon Carter, certify that I had been a resident of the state of Missouri for 6 years and upwards, and that I had suffered many things by a lawless mob, both me and my family having been driven from place to place and suffered the loss of much property and finally expelled from the state." End quote. Now here's one from later on. Quote, "I, William F. Cahoon, hereby certify that in the year of 1838 I was residing in Daviess County, Missouri, and while from home I was taken prisoner in Far West by the militia and kept under guard for 6 or 8 days, in which time I was forced to sign a deed of trust, after which I was permitted to return home to my family in Daviess County, and found them surrounded by an armed force with the rest of my neighbors who were much frightened." Continuing later on in the same letter, "We were not permitted to go from place to place without a pass from the general, and on leaving the county I received a pass as follows." Now he's reading from the actual pass. "I permit William F. Cahoon to pass from Daviess to Caldwell County and there remain during the winter, and thence to pass out of the state of Missouri. In which time both me and my family suffered much on account of cold and hunger, because we were not permitted to go outside of the guard to obtain wood and provision." End quote. Here's a quote from somebody else, same kind of letter where he's complaining to the government. Quote, "I, John M. Burke, hereby certify that General John Clark and his aide, at their arrival at Far West in Caldwell County, Missouri, came to my tavern stand, and without my leave, pitched their marquees in my yard, and did take my wood and hay to furnish the same, and did bring their horses in also, and, without my leave, take hay for them, and did take possession of my house, and use it for a council of house, and did place a strong guard around it, so as to hinder any person from going in or out. And I myself was not permitted to go in and out. For all this I have received no remuneration, and was not even permitted to pass out of town to water travelers' horses without a permit. I also certify that Baldwin, White, Hiram, and Joseph Smith, and McCrae in Clay County, Missouri, did apply for a writ of habeas corpus and did not get it." End quote. so I'll spare you reading any more of those, as they all kind of say similar things. But there are a ton of affidavits from, Jedediah Owen, T. Alvord, William Hawk, Timothy Clark, Urban Stewart, and a number of other saints who all claimed that they had suffered extensively at the hands of the militia during their time living in Missouri. But the next few pages from the history of the church detail some very unimportant occurrences that don't really need to be discussed in depth. Basically, some of the quorum of the 12, especially Bloody Brigham Young, were making their way towards the coast, constantly hindered by sickness, sometimes not making progress for weeks at a time, being laid up in bed. So skipping over those accounts, we finally get to the end of February 1840, when Joe is finally granted a congressional audience to hear his pleas for redress. Granted, he wasn't in front of the entire House. They just appointed a special committee to hear the complaints over a week-long period from the 20th to the 26th of February. Joe and Elias Higbee represented the Mormons during these hearings, and they recount the proceedings rather well in letters that they sent to the brethren in Commerce after each day of these meetings. And of course, all of these letters are included in the History of the Church, Volume 4. Now, we won't read the letters in their entirety, but I'm going to read a few important extracts from each one of them, and we'll discuss them as we go along. And we tend to see a bit of an evolution of the general tone of these committee meetings as we progress further and further from the 20th of February to the 26th. Here's the first letter. This is dated on the 20th, 1840, and it begins as follows, quote, "Dear brother, I have just returned from the committee room, wherein I spoke about 1 hour and a half. There were but 3 of the committee present, for which I am very sorry. I think they will be obliged to acknowledge the justice of our cause. They paid good attention, and I think my remarks were well received. It was a special meeting appointed to hear me by my request. The Missouri senators and representatives were invited to attend. Dr. Lynn and Mr. Jamieson attended, and God gave me courage so that I was not intimidated by them. Dr. Lynn, I thought, felt a little uneasy at times, but manifested a much better spirit afterwards than Mr. Jamieson." End quote. All right, this sets our scene. The committee was made up of a few representatives from Missouri who were not present for this first hearing. Instead, only 3 of the appointed committee were in attendance to hear Joe's petition: Dr. Lynn, Mr. Jamieson, and an unnamed person who doesn't seem to make an appearance in the rest of these letters, maybe until the end. I'm not sure. We don't actually have the meeting minutes from this committee meeting. We're just taking these from the letters that were sent afterwards. Continuing on, quote, "I told them firstly that I represented a suffering people who had been deprived, together with myself, of their rights in Missouri, who numbered something like 15,000 souls. That's a little on the high side. And not only they, but many others were deprived of the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution of the United States. At least the amount of 150,000 freeborn citizens are deprived the enjoyment of citizenship in each or every state. That we had no ingress in the state of Missouri, nor could any of us have only at the expense of our lives, and this by the order of the executive. I then took their own declaration of the cause of our expulsion, referred them to Parley P. Pratt's pamphlet, P cubed, which I held in my hand, then showed that the first accusation therein contained was an account of our religious tenets. Furthermore, that the others were utterly groundless. I went on to prove that the whole persecution from beginning to end was grounded on our religious faith. For evidence of this, I referred them to Porter Rockwell's testimony and P. Powell's. I stated that there was abundant testimony to prove this to be a fact among the documents." End quote. So then, of course, Joe tells them an extremely biased version of the history of the saints in Missouri, no doubt painting a solemn and persecution-ridden picture for these congressmen to contend with. And it continues with Joe getting a little forceful with the situation, which I think may have actually served to his detriment. Continuing on in the letter, quote, "I demanded from them a restitution of all our rights and privileges as citizens of the United States, and damages for all the losses we had sustained in consequence of our persecutions and expulsion from the state. and told them we could have recourse nowhere else on earth that I knew of, that we could not sue an army of soldiers, neither could we go into the state to sue anyone else, because he'd be arrested. I told them that I knew not how far Congress had jurisdiction in the case, or how far they had not, but as far as they had, we claimed the exercise of it for our relief, for we are an injured people, end quote. Now, the next paragraph actually gets into a pretty interesting point, exhibiting why Joe was seeing Congress for this in the first place, and Joe actually does make a really good point here. Quote, Mr. Lynn then said he wished me to answer one thing. If the legislature of the Missouri did not refuse to investigate the subject of our difficulties solely on account of the trials then pending. In reply, I assured him that I knew they had refused us an investigation, but as to that being the cause, I did not know, but told him they might have done it when those trials were discharged. He seemed to think it injustice for Congress to take it up before the legislature had acted on it, end quote. This will end up coming into play at the end of the letters, but essentially, Mr. Lynn asked Joe if he thought that the Missouri investigation into the matter was tabled just because the trial for the Mormon leadership was underway when they tabled it. Now, this may be the case, but it does introduce some interesting paradoxes that Missouri was able to weasel out from underneath instead of properly investigating the legality of removing the Mormons from the state. When the Saints were chased out of Missouri and Joe and the leadership were arrested, they held off full investigation until the leadership could properly be convicted of treason. They figured it'd be sometime in mid-1839 that a ruling would come down convicting Joe and Rigdon of high treason against the United States, which, in turn, would allow the state to pin all legal fault on the Mormons and essentially relieve the state of Missouri of any fault. The thing is, Joe and the leadership had escaped prison. They ran away upon being moved to Boone County for a hearing on a writ of habeas corpus that they drew up, which essentially absolved Missouri of the need to even investigate because, well, the whole problem had been swept under the rug. Most of the Mormons had moved out of the state at that time, and Joe and the leadership had escaped prison. So the question that Lynn asked Joe was tantamount to asking if he would submit to Missouri's investigation, which would imply that if fault were to be found on the part of the Mormons, that Joe would suffer the legal repercussions, which, if Missouri could prove high treason, meant the death penalty for Joe. Missouri handling the investigation made for a lot of long-term ramifications, which may have actually benefited the Saints in the long run, but probably meant that Joe would spend considerable time in prison if he could be convicted of the crimes, or he'd be executed. Now, this might be why Joe was trying to go over Missouri's head in the first place when he petitioned for this meeting with the United States Congress. He could provide a one-sided telling of the Missouri-Mormon War, which he obviously did. Now, if he could get these congressmen on his side without them knowing the nuance and confusion of everything which happened during this conflict, the Mormons could have been given a positive ruling, which would have in turn held Missouri at fault for what had happened, which, of course, would have been beneficial to Joe in more ways than just economic. So at the end of the meeting that day, Mr. Lynn told Joe of something he was a bit afraid of, given what he had told the committee. This is from basically the end of that first letter. Quote, Mr. Lynn observed that there was a gentleman whom he would have before the committee on the morrow who lived in the upper part of Missouri that knew everything relative to the affair. I presume he is to put in his gab. I suppose I must attend the committee, as I'm solicited by the chairman, but I would rather take a flogging, because I must sit still and hear a volubility of lies concerning myself and my brethren. Lies, I say, for they have nothing but lies to tell. That will in the least degree justify their conduct in Missouri. End quote. So after that, Joe came to the realization that they were going to have somebody living in Missouri that was an anti-Mormon basically come to talk to them about it and give their side of the story, which Joe claimed was all lies, of course. Mr. Lynn told Joe that he sent a letter to Judge King, the same judge who handled the November Court of Inquiry, asking for the documents generated during the Court of Inquiry, so that he could see the available testimony upon which King had thrown them in jail, in Liberty Jail, in the first place. Now, this is a quote from later on in that. Quote, "In my remarks, I stated that an article of the Constitution was violated in granting compulsory process for witnesses in behalf of the prisoners, and that the main evidence adduced upon which they were committed was from Dr. Avard." Do we remember Samson Avard there? "Who once belonged to our society, and was compelled to swear as suited them best in order to save his life." So Joe is accusing Dr. Avard as being kind of the main person that the Missourians hung their case on because he was a member of the Danites and he was a general in the army of Israel. And therefore, when Avard defected and brought up his testimony against Joe and the Mormons in the court of inquiry, Joe is just saying that he was doing that because he was threatened that they would kill him if he didn't give positive testimony for them. So anyway, it continues on. "That I knew him," meaning Avard, "to be a man whose character was the worst I ever knew in all my associations or intercourse with mankind, and that I had evidence by affidavits before them of 5 or 6 respectable men to prove that all he swore was false." End quote. So remember back to the Court of Inquiry episode. That was episode number 50. We read through a ton of testimonies provided by more than just Dr. Samson Avard, which implicated Joe and the leadership in a number of military-like actions against the citizens and the militias of Missouri. But Avard's testimony was a substantial nail in Joe's coffin. However, his testimony wasn't necessary to prove everything the Mormons did. It just proved that the Danite Manifesto was a legitimate document. Joe was terrified of this committee learning the other side of things from Avard's testimony or from this unnamed Missourian who was coming in on the morrow. So Joe could try and control the information the committee heard when it was just them in the room, but unfortunately for Joe, the truth would very quickly shine a spotlight on Joe's faults, which he obviously wanted to keep hidden for as long as possible. Which is why he just tried to say that these are all lies. Whoever is going to tell all the testimony against the Mormons, they're speaking nothing but lies. So in the committee meeting the next day, Joe was actually happy about this because the unnamed Missourian couldn't make it that day. But one of the people in the committee had educated himself a bit since the previous day's meeting, and he leveled some interesting accusations which are important to take into context. We spent the 10 historical timeline episodes from episode 40 to 50 covering the Missouri Mormon War, so if you need a refresher, the backlog awaits. But this is the important part. The opening paragraph of Joe's letter the day after the next day's hearing exhibits that Mr. Jamieson understood the situation better than what Joe had anticipated. This is from later on in the Vogel history of the church. Quote, "Mr. Lynn and Mr. Jamieson made some remarks, to which I replied. Mr. Lynn is much more mild and reasonable than Mr. Jamieson, who related a long lingo of stuff which he said was proven before the legislature, which amounted to about this, that Joseph Smith gave the Mormons liberty to trespass on their neighbor's property, also told them that it all belonged to them as they were Israelites. Upon the strength of this, they became the aggressors. I replied that the Jackson County people in their declaration of causes that induced them to unite in order to drive the Mormons, the crime of stealing or trespassing was not mentioned, and there was no docket, either clerks or justices, that could show it in Jackson, Clay, Caldwell, or in Davies counties, and that no man ever heard such a teaching or doctrine from Joseph Smith or any other Mormon, that we held no such doctrine, neither believed it in any such thing." End quote. Okay. So that's really loaded. What happened there? Okay, let's try and debunk what Joe said line upon line here. Mr. Jamieson accused Joe of telling the Mormons, and that's the Danites specifically, to go steal goods from the Missourians in Davies County, saying that the Mormons were the Israelites, and they, of course, implying were the Gentiles, so the Israelites were consecrating the property. The thing is, that accusation is actually true. And the justification Joe used was that the goods and livestock were owned by the Gentiles and the Danites needed to appropriate that consecrated property for the bishop's storehouse. But Joe told them to do so because the Mormons were starving. And they wouldn't survive the winter because the Missourians had chased them out of Carroll County and created a starving refugee crisis which needed to be dealt with somehow. And stealing was the only option the Mormon leadership could think of. But now it's really coming back to bite him in the ass. Joe responded to this accusation by saying the Missourians had started it and there was no mention of the crimes that they'd committed against the Mormons in the first place, which put them in the situation of absolute desperation with the refugee crisis. So both of these are accurate assessments of the situation. Then, however, Joe unequivocally lies about the justification the Mormons used to consecrate, in air quotes, the Gentiles' property. Joe preached that he would be the new Muhammad to this generation and that peace would come by the sword, after which the Danites caused peace in Daviess County by removing all of the non-Mormon Missourians living there. The situation is just too messy to ascertain the truth in the, few hour and a half long meetings that were held between Joe and this investigative congressional committee. Let's read one more excerpt from the letter of the second meeting because I think it illustrates a marked shift from the attitude of the first meeting to how the committee was reacting to day 2 of conversation about the conflict. Quote, I made these remarks partly from motives which I may, at another time, explain to you. He laid a great stress on the trials at Richmond and a constitution that he said Avard and others swore to. That's the Danite Manifesto. Then went on to relate what it contained and that it was written by Sidney Rigdon. That's, Avard told them about the Danite Manifesto and gave the investigative committee in Missouri a copy of the Danite Manifesto that was signed by Sidney Rigdon. Now, this is Joe's reaction. Quote, I flatly denied it, and I could bring all the Mormons, both men, women, and children, besides myself, that would swear before all the world that no such thing ever existed, nor was thought of among the Mormons. End quote. That was the Danite Manifesto. Avard took a copy of that, swore an affidavit of its truth and everything when he defected and provided the testimony against the Mormon leadership during the court of inquiry. And Joe just flatly denied the existence of it. And I can understand why. Because it was essentially a document organizing a Mormon militia and more or less declaring war against anybody who stands against Joe and the leadership, which sure makes Joe look like a military leader. And if a case could be made that he acted in the capacity of a military leader, inciting insurrection against the government of Missouri and by extension the government of the United States, the government had its case made for it, and whatever the Mormons suffered doesn't matter because it was high treason, and Joe was ripe for the death penalty. And another interesting point that the committee made was that Joe needed to provide documentation showing the value of the Saints' land which had been lost. The government wasn't going to pay out any dollar amount to the Mormons unless they could back it up. So this is what the quote is dealing with that. Quote, they inquired very particularly concerning how much land we had entered there, and how much of it yet remained unsold, when Mr. Corwin observed that we had never entered much land there, but were squatters. I then described the size of Caldwell and Daviess County, giving an explanation on these matters. End quote. Now that's an incredibly relevant point here. Most of the land that the Mormons had settled on, indeed, was untamed countryside, and possession of land back then often did amount to just, European Americans moving to a place and improving the land, and eventually the government would just consider the land to be theirs. I mean, the Mormons were trying to do that, but the Missourians didn't want them there, so the Missourians chased the Mormons out before squatters' rights actually kicked in. The point is, the Mormons paid for very little of the land on which they had settled. They paid for the goods and they shouldered the costs of improving the land, but they didn't actually pay most people for any land deeds, making estimations of their land value a very challenging proposition. So Joe and Higbee's recounting of the next day marks an even harsher shift in the perception of the committee. The committee's friend from Missouri finally made it to the meeting and offered his insights to what happened in Missouri during this time. Joe wasn't really happy about it. Quote, I am just informed by General Wall, the chairman of the committee, before whom or to whom our business is referred, that the decision is against us, or in other words, unfavorable, that they believe redress can only be had in Missouri, the courts and the legislature. He says they will report this week. I desire to get a copy of it and also the papers. Now, this is where it shifts to being very pessimistic from Joe's perspective. I feel now that we have made our last appeal to all earthly tribunals, that we should now put our whole trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have a right now which we could not heretofore so fully claim, that is, of asking God for redress and redemption, as they have been refused to us by man." End quote. And things don't get any better after that. The judgment of the investigative committee was delivered on March 4th, 1840, of which these are the important takeaways. Quote, "The petition is drawn up at great length, and sets forth with feeling and eloquence the wrongs of which they complain, justifies their own conduct, and aggravates that of those who they call their persecutors, and concludes by saying they see no redress unless it be obtained by the Congress of the United States, to whom they make their solemn last appeal as American citizens, as Christians, and as men, to which decision they say they will submit. The committee have examined the case presented by the petition and heard the views urged by their agent with care and attention, and after full examination and consideration, unanimously concur in the opinion that the case presented for their investigation is not such a one as will justify or authorize any interposition by this government." It continues later on. The grievances complained of in this petition are alleged to have been done within the state of Missouri. The committee, under these circumstances, have not considered themselves justified in inquiring into the truth or falsehood of the facts charged in the petition. If they are true, the petitioners must seek relief in the courts of the state of Missouri, or of the United States, which has the appropriate jurisdiction to administer full and adequate redress for the wrongs complained of, and doubtless will do so fairly and impartially. Or the petitioners may, if they see proper, apply to the justice and magnanimity of the state of Missouri, an appeal which the committee feel justified in believing will never be made in vain by the injured or oppressed. It can never be presumed that a state either wants the power or lacks the disposition to redress the wrongs of its own citizens, committed within her own territory, whether they proceed from the lawless acts of her officers or any other persons. The committee therefore report that they recommend the following passage of the resolution. Resolved, that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from the further consideration of the memorial in this case, and that the memorialists have leave to withdraw the papers which accompany their memorial." End quote. This was probably the right decision. The Congressional Committee left it up to the state of Missouri to deal with the Mormon problem. States' rights, yay! But Joe refused to step foot inside the state of Missouri ever again. He'd escaped once, and he knew that if he went back to Missouri for any reason, he'd be arrested and held for trial, which is the proper way to handle the Missouri Mormon conflict. Now, let's work with a little bit of a hypothetical here to see what outcome may have existed for the Mormons had Joe actually faced the music. This is my proposed hypothetical. After this congressional committee denied him and sent him back to the Missouri government for redress, let's just say, hypothetically, that Joe went back to Richmond, Missouri, and met with the state legislature petitioning for redress for what the Mormons had suffered. He would have promptly been arrested and had evasion of law enforcement added onto his record, of course, which would only worsen the sentence that he would inevitably receive. But he would spend some time in jail while the state gathered the evidence they needed to convict Joe of treason, while him and probably General Donovan compiled their defense case. Now, this likely would have taken over a year to get to the bottom of, and Joe probably would have been convicted of treason and sentenced to the gallows, assuming that he made it that far without a vigilante mob taking care of the problem long before the hearing ever happened. But nested in that hypothetical are a couple of possible outcomes. Let's just say that Donovan was as good of a lawyer as the Mormons thought he was and could successfully defend Joe against all the allegations, including high treason against the United States. The state of Missouri would be forced to admit fault and they would be held accountable for tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages against the Mormons, undoubtedly worthy of a state Supreme Court ruling to come down with because it was such a high-profile case. But Missouri was the original state where the Dred Scott case was originally brought up, so I wouldn't exactly trust their Supreme Court judgment on what was really fair. But let's keep running with that hypothetical positive outcome for Joe and the Mormons, right? Because the negative outcome means that Joe is sentenced to death. So what? But if it turned out positively for Joe and the Mormons and they were able to exonerate Joe of the charges, I think this is a fascinating kind of hypothetical. They would have been paid, the Mormons, they would have been paid for their trouble, and they likely would have been given license to resettle on the lands they'd been chased from. And Governor Lilburn Boggs undoubtedly would have suffered legal repercussions for issuing the Mormon extermination order. In the best possible outcome of this scenario, Jackson County would have been reopened to the Mormons, and they could go about settling the untamed lands around their declared promised land, independence. They may even have been permitted, through much trial and tribulation against the citizens, to build their revered temple on the dedicated plot to bring about the second coming of Jesus. Now, that means that Nauvoo, Illinois likely never would have been a thing, and Joe wouldn't have died in Carthage. Now, granted, this whole hypothetical line of, illogic is constructed purely on a hypothetical built on top of other hypotheticals and the best possible outcome for the Mormons. But even if it was incomprehensibly fleeting, there was a tiny chance that this situation would have turned out in the favor of the saints, thus forever altering the course of American history. My overall point with these hypotheticals is to point out that the system existed in a way that could have delivered justice to the Mormons. Of course, that system is heavily influenced by the constituent people who make up said system, and their biases can't always be parsed out and disconnected from the system, but it is constructed in a way which attempts to be the most just system for the most people. Joe could have gone down the existing proper legal avenues. There's no telling what the outcome could have been, but he could have done the right thing, legally speaking, instead of just trying to go over Missouri's head with this little bullshit petition to Congress, which they wholly rejected on the grounds that Joe was skipping the proper legal steps. So Joe knew how things were going after the first meetings, and he actually didn't even stick around D.C. for the judgment. The same day that it was delivered, he made his way back to Nauvoo. And this is the entry from March 4th, 1840 on page 72 of the Vogel History of the Church. Quote, I arrived safely at Nauvoo after a wearisome journey, through alternate snows and mud, having witnessed many vexatious movements in government officers, whose sole object should be the peace and prosperity and happiness of the whole people. But instead of this, I discovered that popular clamor and personal aggrandizement were the ruling principles of those in authority, and my heart faints within me when I see the visions of the Almighty, the end of this nation, if she continues to disregard the cries and petitions of her virtuous citizens, as she has done and is now doing. On my way home, I did not fail to proclaim the iniquity and insolence of Martin Van Buren towards myself and an injured people, which will have its effect upon the public mind, and he may never be elected again to the office of trust or power, by which he may abuse the innocent and let the guilty go free. End quote. This meeting that Joe had with this congressional committee was a complete and utter failure for Joe and the Mormons. The only thing left that they could do was to accept the outcome of the hearing and go through the proper channels of the Missouri government. But Joe understandably refused to go back to Missouri. He didn't want to be arrested. So the Mormons and the government were at a bit of an impasse. And this is how it would remain for the rest of Joe's life. It remains even today. The Missouri Investigative Committee had tabled the investigation into the Missouri-Mormon conflict until July of 1839. I said that a little bit earlier. As that's when they expected to have a criminal hearing on Joe, because that criminal hearing would give them ammunition in pinning the fault on Joseph. But that hearing never happened, and the investigation into the faults of the Missouri government never happened either. You know, a little bit of history can go a long way towards shattering modern-day perceptions. Let me give you an example, just in apropos of what we discussed today. I've heard the story of the Mormons being chased out of Jackson County and Missouri as a whole glossed over dozens of times, completely ignoring the important nuance which puts everything into context. It's often told in a way something along the lines of, oh, the saints suffered religious persecution in Missouri and were chased out by the mobs and were never repaid for all the property and goods the mob stole. Actually, none of that sentence is completely true. Every bit of it lacks full truth in some way, shape, or form. So let me try and revise that sentence to make it more accurate. And this is how I make the case that a little bit of history can go a long way. The Mormons suffered vigilante violence, common of alien groups in frontier 19th century America. After months of armed conflict with small groups of casualties, the Missouri government mobilized nearly 5,000 militiamen to end the Mormon problem in Missouri once and for all, and they were subsequently removed from the state. Joseph Smith, fearing the death penalty for high treason against the United States government, sought redress for what the saints suffered, but the U.S. government kicked the issue back to the Missouri government where the issue should have been handled in the first place. Instead of going through the proper legal channels for recourse, Joseph wouldn't set foot back in Missouri to face the consequences of his actions, and the Mormons were never repaid for their loss of property and life. You see, that's how I would rephrase that. And that single sentence that I said earlier heaped on such a massive pile of steaming bullshit and couched the hearer's knowledge of the conflict as solely religious persecution. It ignored every bit of nuance and painted the Mormons as victims, and it required my 4 sentences of revision just now to unpack everything and to try and set the record somewhat straight, even though I just glazed over the whole scenario with just hitting on a couple of the high points. My point is, in order to debunk that single sentence claim from earlier about it being nothing but religious persecution, it requires reading a number of books and understanding the social and political dynamic between Missouri and the Mormons over the span from 1831 to 1840. That takes a lot of work and time and research to understand. So it's so much easier to say the saints were persecuted, massacred, and ultimately chased out of Missouri because of the extermination order. You know, we can't judge the truth of a religion or of a prophet based on persecution alone, or really any group of people, right? But that's how this whole thing is often perceived by the followers of said religion or prophet. If the followers can somehow paint Joseph Smith as a righteous and pious man who was persecuted apropos of nothing, it fits their narrative and somehow translates to him being a true prophet, while the unwashed masses personify the adversary with each and every persecutorial action. But if we look at Joe in context, nothing that we see lends any credibility to him being a prophet, whatever a prophet might be. Instead, we just see a dude with overpowering vices who was incredibly inept and ill-educated, constantly making very human mistakes and looking for easy answers to his problems. And when no easy answer existed, he usually ran away from the problems that he'd created for himself. If we try and judge the righteousness or the accuracy of a person's claims based solely on how much they are persecuted, now I'm going to throw the grenade into the conversation. Wouldn't Hitler be our forerunning modern-day prophet? I mean, think about this. At the time of Hitler's death in 1945, hundreds of millions of people wanted him dead, and they were persecuting the Nazis, massacring them and chasing them out of Poland and France and Belgium and Africa and Russia and everywhere else that they'd settled under their glorious leader. Most major world governments were persecuting the Nazis constantly since their rise under the great prophet Addy, right? The point I'm trying to make here is context in history really matters. We can't just look at the snapshot of what was happening at the end of World War II in 1945 to try and make a judgment on the persecution complex against Hitler and the Nazis, right? Well, that's what people do when we just try and say that Joseph Smith was persecuted when the Mormons were chased out of Missouri. We're only looking at a snapshot of a couple months of 1838 when everything prior from the 7.5 years before that puts everything into context. We have to understand historical figures like Joseph and even Hitler in proper context to paint a holistic picture of them and what they did. You see how problematic it becomes when we claim truth of somebody based solely on the amount of persecution that they suffered? A true religion, persecution does not make.
I'm Ryan McKnight, and welcome to the Mormon Leaks Minute.
So many answers and assurances can come through daily searching and studying the scriptures, and with sincere and pleading prayer. But there are no such promises on the internet.
Welcome, everybody, to our second installment of the Mormon Leaks Minute. Given everything we have to talk about today, it might turn into the Mormon Leaks Hour. Of course, we have to invite on our correspondent, the face of the MormonLeaks.io, Ryan McKnight. Thank you very much for joining me today, Ryan.
Thank you, Bryce.
We met up at Sunstone, and we had some very interesting discussions while we were there. Before we actually get into talking about the leak today, I kind of want to do a little bit of a wrap-up of kind of your thoughts on Sunstone and, you know, what your experience was. Was this your first Sunstone, Ryan?
It was. It was definitely my first Sunstone, and I probably had never even heard of Sunstone until maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I'd never even heard of it.
No kidding. But yeah. your first Sunstone, you had, what was it, 3 panels that you were a part of?
Yeah, I had 2 presentations that were related to, you know, my website, Mormon Leaks, and then I helped organize and participated in a panel that was dealing with marijuana and sort of the moral and spiritual justifications of marijuana, why people should not be afraid of this sort of wave of legalization that we're seeing around the country. And since I'm from Nevada, which has become a very marijuana-friendly state, and I have friends in the industry, I was able to sort of put together a really awesome panel on that.
That was one of my favorite presentations that I did attend, and that may be because I had a small selection bias. I didn't attend very many presentations. I was hobnobbing for most of the time, but that was one of the more fascinating ones I attended. Having kind of the 3-pronged approach of kind of marijuana use, the medicinal benefits of it, then having a little bit of the history, and then having you chime in with kind of your disconnected advocation for it. I think it was a really powerful panel. That was one of my favorite presentations, like I said.
Thank you.
But of course, you gave a couple of presentations on Mormon Leaks, one of which I only saw one, but you actually had Privacy P. Pratt remote in for one of those with a voice masker. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, he sounded like a serial killer in a movie calling into the police station to tell him where the body's hidden.
Right? Or for listeners of My Book of Mormon, it sounded just like David Michael.
Okay.
So that was a really fun panel, and I was really glad to have the Q&A section. But you guys did talk a little bit about just kind of the general idea of Mormon Leaks and how it's been received. And one of your focuses was on the recent dump that you did of 37 documents from Bruce R. McConkie. And I kind of wanted to bring you on to talk about those today. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Awesome. So you recently put this out. This was last week that you dumped these? It was 37 documents from the, let me look here.
37. I believe it was 37, maybe 36, but I believe it was 37. And it was last Monday. It was Pioneer Day, July 24th.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
So I've spent most of today perusing some of these documents. Granted, many of them are not very interesting, and they are just McConkie's treatises on certain topics, but there are a few that I really enjoyed reading through, some of which I didn't get all the way through because obviously there are a couple of documents here that are, plus 50 pages. Yeah. But I wanted to, I did pull some extracts that I was hoping we could read through and discuss because there's just... There's some gold in here, man. This is an absolute gold mine of fun quotes from McConkie. So McConkie, for the listeners who aren't aware of who Bruce R. McConkie is, he was an apostle of the church, not a prophet, and he was essentially one of the foremost theologians for the church from the 50s, early 50s, all the way up until his death in, I believe it was early 80s. And there are a number of talks that are included in this document dump. There are a couple of these messages from the first presidency and stuff. And all of these, as far as you could verify, were unpublished. None of these have been published previously on the internet. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's definitely safe to say that none of them are on the internet. I have come to find out, and I still have not 100% verified this, but I believe there is one that was at some point published as maybe like this obscure pamphlet or something, not even by the church. It's the one that's titled How to Start a Cult.
Yes. But I wanted to talk to you.
It's probably one of the ones you want to talk about. It's definitely not online, and I haven't been able to confirm that there ever was a pamphlet, but it's possible that one was at one point published in a pamphlet. But as far as I can tell, none of these other ones have ever been seen outside of people who have been given access to these private files.
Very interesting. Let me ask, what has been the blowback for this document dump?
Well, you know this because you were at Sunstone. Anybody that was at Sunstone knows that I announced there that we did receive a takedown notice a couple days after releasing them. Actually, as I was on my way to the Sunstone dinner on Wednesday night, which was sort of kind of the opening ceremonies, is when I received the takedown letter. So, and I know you probably have questions about that, and I may be able to answer some, but I am going to keep my comments at this time somewhat limited on that because we have not had a full consultation with our attorney yet.
Awesome. Well, since all of the documents are up right now, of course, there are links to everything in the show notes. I look forward to kind of following the trail of the line of possession as this goes from you and this agency back and forth. This is going to be interesting because this is definitely the most controversial blowback that you've received from this. But while we're here, let's make some lemonade while we have the lemons in front of us. I want to pull some of these extracts and read some quotes and just kind of discuss these things with you and throw them against the wall, see what sticks.
Okay.
The first one I want to talk about, and you told me this at Sunstone that I should look through this because it's really fascinating. It is a document titled, quote, "The Receipt of the Revelation Offering the Priesthood to Men of All Races and Colors." Mm-hmm. So what is this document?
Well, this is hands down my favorite one of this whole batch, and it is probably the least controversial one as well. There's really, and I should just say as a blanket statement, if anybody's coming to these documents looking for some sort of like bombshell, controversial statement, there really isn't one, but there's definitely, like we're going to talk about, a lot of really interesting themes and insights. But this particular document is Bruce McConkie's firsthand account of everything that happened leading up to the lifting of the ban of blacks in the priesthood. And it's not like it's a lot of people when I say that they're thinking, oh, so did he say he really agreed with it or that he really didn't want to do it? He doesn't really talk about it in that sense. It's not about how he felt about it. It's more of like a timeline. And it's more like,
stuff.
We did this, then we did that, then we did this. And to read it from somebody who was actually involved, that firsthand account, as opposed to somebody recounting what they heard, is I was on when I first received that document. I was really on the edge of my seat and from the start to finish.
Oh, definitely. I'm going to read a couple of extracts from it because it's really fascinating. So one of the first paragraphs here discusses it introduces the document here. It says, quote, okay. "In recent months, one aspect or another of this matter has come up for informal discussions in various regular meetings of the First Presidency and the 12. And of course, the issue that he's discussing, of course, is race in the priesthood. There have been discussions, for instance, about patriarchal blessings for Negroes and about the problems we might encounter in Brazil after the dedication of the Sao Paulo Temple." I mean, he says it right there. Like that's kind of one of our problems is the Sao Paulo Temple is going to be empty. As a matter of historical fact, many of the early settlers in Brazil were Portuguese and African Negroes. There was extensive intermarriage. It is generally felt that an appreciable part of the Brazilian nation is now composed of people who have some degree or other of Negro blood in their veins. Many of these have no facial or other physical characteristics to indicate in any way that they have any Negro ancestry. Many of our church congregations, particularly in northern Brazil, have in them full or part blood Negroes. The social problem existing in the United States are not found in Brazil to any appreciable degree, and so this intermixture of races has not caused problems except with reference to priesthood ordinations and the prospects of temple blessings, end quote. I love that paragraph because it just shows that it's like, yeah, so the racism that we have against, people from African American descent here in North America, they don't have that in Brazil. It turns out that we're just exporting our bigotry there. So we need to actually deal with this because the Sao Paulo temple is going to be empty once we dedicate it.
And you know what, this paragraph and then the rest of it really, what one of the things that I took away from it is, there is a glaring lack of, we received this revelation from Jesus that it was time to lift the ban.
So what do you think that we should kind of take away from McConkie's recounting of these events?
Well, a lot of people have mentioned to me about how, they actually had wardrobe changes throughout this whole process that were surprising to them. That they actually took the time to get into their temple clothes, that it was very sort of ceremonial. And a lot of people have, I've seen online, talked about how that's kind of an indicator for them that these guys really do believe.
Of course.
And I can't really dispute that point, because if it was, just these guys in a room conniving to come up with the best business decision, why would they go through the trouble of doing a prayer circle and all that kind of stuff? So I thought that that's definitely interesting. I'm
surprised that that's even much of a matter of dispute among even the ex-Mormon community of whether or not these guys sincerely believe what they claim to believe.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would go that far personally. I do think that there's, it's hard to know what the operation of a person's mind is, right? Obviously that's just an impossible thing to do, but
yeah.
I think this is definitely a win for their column. Let's just say that.
Okay.
In the balance of sort of evidence that they don't believe or do believe, this is definitely one that they're around that they're going to win.
Yeah. That I think that's fair, but that's something I'll have to talk about later.
That's a whole podcast in and of itself.
Yeah,
right?
and maybe I'll diatribe about that a little bit later. When I've talked to Mormon creationists, because it is a special branding of creationist, I've never heard it articulated the McConkie way, but in reading through some of these documents, I really see the remnants of their rhetoric evolving from McConkie's treatises on the creation myth of Mormonism. There's one document that I pulled. I didn't pull anything from, but I'm going to pull it up here, and it's really fascinating. The title of it is Chapter Whatever, Some Miscellaneous Questions and Answers on the Creation.
And is this about the resurrected cow? This is one of my favorite ones, yeah.
All right, so let me read this here. Question: during the creation, how were animals placed upon the earth? Answer: and this, I just think this captures Mormon creationism so well. I love this. Answer: this, unfortunately, is something few numbers of the church understand. It has nothing whatsoever to do with evolution. Animals were placed upon the earth in the same way Adam and Eve were. They were born of resurrected parents. A resurrected cow, for instance, came from an earth which has already passed through what we now experience and through the normal birth processes had offspring. So by this model, every animal, including Homo sapien that dies on a planet is resurrected and has spirit babies in perpetuity on their planet. So there are resurrected, there are cow planets or something. This is just baffling for a concept in my mind.
Listen, this idea that leads McConkie to suggest such a scenario is so deeply rooted in we'll call it deep Mormon doctrine. I hope people realize it. I mean, in typical Christianity, right? They and I'm going to sort of paint a broad brush here. Okay, so I know there's all kinds of variations out there, but if we paint Christianity in a broad brush, God is this sort of unknown entity. Like, we don't necessarily know the exact nature of God, but we know he's an entity and that he created everything. And so Christian creationists, they're going to say, something that believe the earth is like 6,000 years old and started with Adam and Eve. They're just going to simply say, God created everything, right? And so, right. But in Mormonism, we have this little quirk where we claim not only to know that God has a body of flesh and bones, but that he went through the same process that we're going through. Now, when you introduce that idea, the fact that God achieved his godhood through, this process, you then have to say, well, where did the animals first come from? Because if the God that we worship was not the original creator of all matter, like a typical Christian would believe, where did these cows come from? And one of the reasons why Bruce R. McConkie was so popular in his day is because all of these questions that come out of this exploration of deep doctrine, and when you sit down to consider this idea that God is a progressed being and all this kind of stuff, and you take a look at this idea that Bruce R. McConkie pushed in all these documents and in his life about there was no death before the fall and all this kind of stuff, and you start asking these questions that are problems that come up, Bruce R. McConkie had this amazing ability to come up with an answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, my.
And so somebody comes and says, well, where did animals come from? And so he says, well, shoot. God was once on another planet and he reached this exaltation. Animals probably had the same progression. So, he put man on earth, and we were born of our resurrected heavenly father and mother. The cow must have been too. And it's really brilliant when you think about it. And I gotta be honest with you, when I was a believing Mormon, I never knew about this cow scenario. But I did, especially when I was on my mission, I did try to read a lot of these sort of deep doctrinal explanations that were out there by various apostles and prophets. There's a famous compendium of books that I believe has been published into one big book. It's something called like Answers to Gospel Questions or something like that. And it was written by Joseph F. Smith or Joseph Fielding Smith, one of those F. Smith guys. And it's this huge 1,000+ page book where he just dives into all of this like really, really deep doctrine. And if anybody's ever heard about how Mormons believe that Bigfoot is Cain walking the earth, that's one of the things that's addressed in this book, and he actually talks about that in this book. But one of the things that I loved about Mormonism was that we had all of these really logical explanations for all of these holes that there are in traditional Christianity. And I think McConkie was simply just filling another one of those holes. And if you think about it from a religious standpoint, it's not, it is kind of crazy, but it's not like it's not the craziest thing that's ever been said, I don't think.
Well, I think the point that you're getting at is what McConkie's version of Mormonism, however far that deviates from modern-day Mormonism or isn't discussed in modern-day Mormonism, that version is internally consistent. It doesn't stand up to the least bit of external scrutiny, of course, but internally speaking, it's consistent.
And it's logical, right? It's logical.
Yeah, it's circularly logical, but it is logical at some level. And I think what you're saying is perfectly captured in another paragraph that's an answer to another question in this same document. I'm going to read this real quick. It says, when they, the creators, that is all the noble and great ones who helped Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael in the creation, when they helped, they literally planted seeds. This we understand from both the temple account and the Pearl of Great Price accounts of the creation. Where did they get the seeds? From another sphere, from which they brought them. This means that the same kinds of animals and vegetables exist on all other worlds. Everybody, your salad, you're eating a resurrected salad. The seeds came from some other planet or planets. The same thing is true of horses, elephants, and all animals. Now, this is the line that I want to just focus on for a second, because this is exactly what you're talking about here, Ryan. Quote, but this is so far beyond the saints that we don't preach it, end quote. It's logically consistent, but you have to know so much about the deep Mormon stuff. You have to be like the sublime Mormon degree in order to even start to comprehend what McConkie is talking about. And then he writes these massive treatises on deep Mormon doctrine that Mormons today don't know about or don't care about or don't pay any attention to. It's just fascinating that this is the undercurrent of McConkie Mormonism that's underlying modern day Mormonism.
Yeah, and this is the $60 filet mignon in the world of milk before meat. I mean, when you get to the meat part of Mormonism, you're getting to the sirloin steak or whatever. This is the pinnacle of the meat. Yeah, that never gets talked about.
So there's a couple of other things that I want to discuss with you about this. You made reference to it earlier. What is this document, How to Start a Cult? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Have you read through that whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read the entire thing. It's one of the longer ones, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's huge.
I definitely read quite a bit of it, and I definitely skimmed it from top to bottom. But basically, what it is my initial reading of it is that it's sort of a word of warning. Now, people shouldn't get excited about this whole thing, How to Start a Cult. A lot of people got excited when they saw the name. It's a funny name. But just for those that aren't looking at the documents yet, he actually, when you open it up, you actually see some alternate titles that he was toying with.
Yeah.
So,
and this is a response piece, too.
Right. What he was really doing was he was sort of like identifying what a false prophet is.
Yeah.
And sort of giving a word of warning to look out for false prophets and sort of saying that, false prophets go out and create cults. That was my reading of it. I don't know if that's the way you read it or not, but
yeah. Well,
that's what I read.
It was a response to the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. That was a breakoff faction, the LeBaron Order that was founded in 1955, and everything about it. I didn't see any direct reference to LeBaron himself, but one of the alternate titles is Cultism as Practiced by the So-Called Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times Analyzed, Explained, and Interpreted. So, I mean,
wasn't that the church, I don't know if you know this or not, and I feel like that was the one church that was sort of started by the husband of the daughter of one of the apostles?
I have no idea. So I've heard reference to it before, but I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, I was just reading about this, and, maybe you can edit a little of this. I'm going to look it up because I'm almost positive that... So Bryce, I've pulled up the Wikipedia page for Church of the Firstborns for those that don't know about it. Not an expert here, but it says here, the Church of the Firstborn was a sect of the Latter-day Saint movement that formed as an offshoot of the Mormon Church in 1861. So that was when they originally, and they were had to do with the Morrisite War. What is this? Yeah, this is interesting. So it is something that I guess was around for quite a while, according to this Wikipedia page. It was started in 1857 by Joseph Morris, who was an English convert to the church.
Ah, the Morrisites. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess they're tied to the Morrisites. People should look it up here. It does, there's some interesting little history here. So
yeah, definitely. This is tapping into my ignorance of anything beyond the Missouri years. I only know a little bit about the Nauvoo years. This is long beyond that, and this is talking about the LeBaron Order, the Church of the Firstborn. It essentially descended from one of these, the Morrisites possibly, or just, it was one of the many breakoff factions of the church practicing polygamy after the manifesto. And it looks like, just reading a cursory on the Wikipedia page, it has quite a sordid past. So there's, that offers a little bit of historical context of why Bruce R. McConkie wrote a paper called How to Start a Cult. Because he was obviously disparaging this small cult that had cropped up and started gaining some traction in the 1950s that was created by these Alma brothers, the LeBarons. So, yeah, fascinating stuff. All right, so moving on from that, people, look it up for yourselves. I'm sure. I hope to maybe receive, some further information from a listener who knows a little bit more about that, because I know nothing about.
Yeah, and it does look like, and just so you know, I just did look up LeBaron, and it does look like it's kind of a separate group from that original Morrisite, and he just happened to use the Church of the Firstborn as part of the name. It actually was a longer one. It was called the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. And that's, I think, the one that he was probably responding to. And their big beef over the mainstream church was polygamy. They wanted to continue the polygamy, and they were trying to do it after the manifesto. And ultimately in the 50s or whenever it was, that's when they kind of split.
Yeah. Obviously, as I said earlier, very sordid past with one of these, one of the hundreds of breakoff factions of the Mormon Church. So,
just to bring this back to what we're talking about with McConkie and him making throughout his whole life and included in these documents these outrageous scientific claims, such as the cow coming from a resurrected cow, and there being no death prior to the fall, and all of these things. When these guys make these outrageous claims as if they were given fact, when they're later proved wrong by science. At some point we couldn't maybe prove him wrong, but now that we can just say how ridiculous these things are, where does that leave us as Mormons with this apostle and what he said? I mean, okay, he's speaking. Now we go to he's speaking as a man. Well, then how do we know when any of them are speaking as men or not until after they die and 20 years later? All of these issues are all intertwined.
Yeah, I think that you wrapped it together really well. It shows that people can exist with a level of cognitive dissonance, even if they are incredibly educated, like Bruce R. McConkie was. When he was writing these treatises against evolution and about these things, he says, no one who is dealing with the true sciences ever seems perturbed. If I found fault with physics or chemistry or mathematics, the people would just go on their merry ways. But as soon as I raise something about evolution, then people jump on my back about this. Well, that's because he understood a very cursory teaching of evolution and understood that this is a fatal flaw to his model of reality. He understood that physics, chemistry, and mathematics are descriptive of the world around him. I don't think he understood that evolution is a descriptive scientific theory of the world around him. And obviously it came into conflict with his own version of God, because it showed that death is necessary for human life to exist. And his model of Christianity, his model of Mormonism, required that no death existed until after humans came onto the planet and fell from grace. So it obviously you can only live with so much cognitive dissonance, and somebody who was obviously as intelligent as Bruce R. McConkie was, he went through incredible lengths in order to make his understanding of reality comport with his theology. And obviously, in order to do so, he had to bend and pretzel his theology to all sorts of weird shapes and sizes in order to make that work. But somehow he was able to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to say that I also think one other very important point of all of this that people should also remember is that this rhetoric that he was spewing revolving around evolution, that a lot of people were spewing, is also a feeder of the idea of this false dichotomy out there among Mormons and other creationists that it's either God or evolution. Right?
Yeah.
And it's this whole idea that you can't, not only can you not have both of them at the same time. Bruce R. McConkie thought they were both incompatible, but if you could find a flaw in evolution or an evolutionary theory or part of it, that it somehow proves the existence of God. And as many very intelligent atheists, much more intelligent than me, have pointed out before in various different forums, even if we found out tomorrow that the entire framework of the theory of evolution was somehow wrong and fabricated, it does not mean that all of a sudden that God exists. But he's setting that false dichotomy up with his rhetoric.
Yeah, and it's logical fallacy built on top of logical fallacy.
Yeah.
And obviously he had some level of cognitive dissonance about these things, or else that wouldn't have been an underlying theme through so many of these writings, included in just 37 of obviously hundreds or, possibly thousands of documents that he wrote about this same subject or about any of his theology.
Absolutely.
So this was, I said earlier, this was a thorn in his paw. He had a problem with evolution, and I think he's one of those type of preachers who has homosexual tendencies or whatever, and rallies really hard against those damn gays, and God's gonna kill all the fags and stuff because he has he's projecting, right? He has these personal problems. I think he was projecting the what he perceived the weaknesses of his own theology onto Darwinism in general, because that showed a tragic flaw in his own version of Mormonism.
I think you just hit on something. I think you just hit it head on right there. He was internally realizing that evolution made sense on some level, and he was ascribing those thoughts and feelings to Satan tempting him.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore, evolution must be one of Satan's tools. Mm-hmm. I think you hit it right on the head. I think you nailed it.
Well, and he says it right there, Darwin, who holds a position of influence in the courts of hell, is its patron saint, saying evolution was its own religion. Like, he's obviously saying that he's conflating Darwin and Satan, saying that if you believe in Darwin, therefore you believe in Satan, and you are going to go to be with the Church of Evolution down in the, what does he say? In the burning agony in the spits of Sheol. Like, he had a serious problem with evolution, and I think that's just because that was a black spot in his own theology.
Yeah, and let's remember that one of his colleagues, Henry B. Eyring's father, I don't know if he was ever an apostle, but he was definitely up there in leadership, was a huge proponent of the theory of evolution.
I wasn't aware of that. Wow.
Oh, yes. And yes, in fact, it's very well documented that he and McConkie and other brethren clashed on this subject.
Wow.
Henry Eyring's father was I want to say it was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, or one of those big scientific prizes. He was a winner of one of those in the world of science. He was a renowned scientist, and he often talked about how the church needs to sort of realize that evolution is there, and maybe we need to start thinking that maybe that was just the mechanism that God used. So
yeah, it's moving the goalpost, right? If evolution comes in conflict with creationism, then let's call it intelligent design and say that evolution was all part of the plan. Well, when it's trying to nail jelly to a wall, it just doesn't work. All right. Anyway, that's as I said at the onset, this is probably going to be the Mormon Leaks Hour because we had so much to talk about. When you dump 37 documents on us, it's kind of hard to not spend an hour talking about all of them. So
I don't want to say this is like only the beginning, but maybe it is only the beginning. I don't know.
Well, yeah. Unless that takedown notice has some legal merit, we'll have to see, and we'll be following along at MormonLeaks.io to see.
Yeah, and we'll do another Mormon Leaks Minute when we finally get our thing out and do that. So
awesome. It sounds good to me. Well, Ryan, thank you for coming on as our Mormon Leaks correspondent for our Mormon Leaks Hour for today.
Yeah.
And of course, there will be links to MormonLeaks.io in the show notes if people want to chase this down. Be looking for that 37-page document dump from Bruce R. McConkie, because there are definitely some gems. I only pulled out a couple of extracts to talk about, but there's so much more to read. And I can't wait to get through this 51-page How to Start a Cult. That's amazing. So, Ryan, thanks for coming on, man. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.
All right, that'll pretty much do it for the episode today. Of course, I do want to thank our correspondent, Ryan McKnight, for coming on to talk about that. There was some very interesting conversation. And of course, Patreon listeners will get an extended part of the conversation that we discussed quite in depth some of the other parts of the Bruce R. McConkie leaks, including his vehement hatred of evolution. So to kind of wrap up today's show, I want to read an email that I received from Ed. I don't think Ed minds if I use his first name on the show today. And it kind of introduces us into a little bit of a discussion about Sunstone and everything that happened. So Ed says, damn, first I've just got to say, as a casual listener to Naked Mormonism, I loved the Smith Entheogen episodes. As someone still paying for their philosophy BA and religion minor class of 97, gotta love those US student loans, I've investigated a lot of history of many religions, especially Judaism and early Christ cults, and studied history of some Buddhism and Hinduism, etc. And there are entheogens galore in all those religions. Look at Bong Lassie, etc., and the theories about anointing oils in Judaism. I mean, I don't know anything about that. I'd love to hear some more. Also, I have a Danish ancestor who was brought over to Nebraska, and because she didn't approve of polygamy and fell in love with my great-grandfather, she left Mormonism and stayed there outside of Omaha while her father went on to Idaho to become a pillar of a community and get a second wife. As an early 40s guy who grew up Methodist in Nebraska, then moved to Ireland in 99 to be with my girlfriend, now wife of almost 15 years, I admire your resolve to go to this conference and present your case in front of your former faith. Most of my family probably knows that I've been a dirty secular humanist since graduating college, but I've never admitted it to them. All I occasionally get is my Catholic sister's reply to a Carl Sagan post that I've made, where she cuts and pastes some post she obviously Googled about Sagan and atheism and how he was more of an agnostic, and that whatever he was, he knows now because he's dead. As someone always searching for the truth, I try to keep it low-key, not insult her faith, but I did point out her approbation from this Catholic Pathos blog. I never received a reply. At any rate, all the best for Sunstone to you two. You're an inspiration to this old, cynical, skeptical, secular bastard, and make me want to speak my mind to the top of the world. All the best. Keep it rocking. Thank you very much for that email, Ed. And no need to apologize for an entheogenic-induced rambling haze. It was really a pleasure to read that email and just to get it in. So I want to use that as kind of a jump off to talk about what happened at Sunstone, and use it also as a thank you to all of those who do support monetarily, because without you, I wouldn't have been able to go to Sunstone. Cody and I wouldn't have been able to put the time and effort necessary into the presentation and the paper in order to make it a success that it was at Sunstone. So to the people who do support, I just want you to know that what you are essentially funding with the Patreon dollars, you're not funding, or you're not buying a product. You are funding research, and you're funding the ability of me and this group and the secular Mormonism to be built, and to go to conferences and make the connections necessary, and to make these presentations that will hopefully introduce interesting conversations about the historicity of Joseph Smith and what he truly did. You know, that's not something that you can really, fill up a glass with, right? That's not a product that you can put in your house. That's not something that you actually get a tangible return on. And I recognize that, and that's why I try and create extra content for the Patreon supporters, and why we do these things, and why we're trying to evolve into possibly doing live shows where patrons are given certain perks and access to those live shows and whatnot. Because when you do support, that's what you are essentially funding, is the foundation of the secular Mormonism community. So thank you so much for those of you that do support. And if you are considering supporting, maybe now's the time to pull the trigger. But of course, the caveat always is, if you are somebody who's a student or who is on a fixed income or otherwise can't afford, don't worry about it. Consume the free show. The information out there is put on for free. And if you ever do get into a situation where you do have, a couple extra bucks per month, we'd love it if you'd kick it our way. That being said, there are a couple of things that I do need to wrap up, just kind of with relation to what was going on in Salt Lake this past week and why this episode came out later than usual. People listening in the backlog won't care about this, but the point is, we did the Sunstone presentation and it was a resounding success. And the number of connections that we've made to people who are helping us with new leads, helping Cody and I to track down new aspects of the Smith entheogen theory, are going to be timeless and incredibly useful connections. So thanks to our ability to go to Sunstone, we were able to forward this research and kind of bring it into the public eye a little bit more. I do want to also say that Marie and I did the live show at Squatters Pub. That episode is up on the My Book of Mormon podcast feed. You can listen to it there. It was really a lot of fun. We played a couple of drinking games. We read through the chastity section of the Strength of the Youth pamphlet, which any ex-Mormons will say, oh God, I remember that thing. So yeah, that was really a lot of fun, and it was really cool to see listeners' faces out in the crowd. Of course, after that, Marie and I went to church at the Joseph Smith Memorial Building on the Sunday following the live show, and that was quite interesting. And Marie had some interesting thoughts and kind of a unique take on some of the talks that were given, because I was sitting there just almost having these like Vietnam flashbacks of times that I'd sat through incredibly boring church sessions and sacrament meetings before, and she was, taking notes furiously about what the people were discussing. And afterwards, we went back and recorded with the general authority of the My Book of Mormon podcast, that's the Duke of Earl Grey. We recorded section 93 with him of the Doctrine and Covenants, so that is going to go up on the podcast feed, I believe, in another day or two. But for those who do support Patreon on the My Book of Mormon feed, you are going to see a Patreon-only episode where Marie and I talk with Duke of Earl Grey about what we experienced at church. And that was really a fun conversation. So if you're wanting to get on some extra content, Marie and I usually create an extra episode every single week for just the patrons. So consider supporting over on that end. So beyond that, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. And that buttons it up for the evening. I do want to say we are doing our Nemo Home Evening tomorrow night at the time that this is airing. That's going to be on August 7th, starting at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, bringing on friend of the show, Marissa Alexa McCool of the Inciting Incident podcast, the Sister Out of Hand podcast, author, amazing blogger and podcaster, and who's affiliated with, I think, like 94 different projects at any given time. So we're really stoked to talk to Riss, and if you are a patron supporter, you will see an email in your inbox that is an invite to the Google Hangout, where you can come in and join the conversation or just kind of listen as it's going on. And of course, that conversation will air in the following couple of days for the podcast, or for the Patreon supporters. So be looking forward to that. With that, let's thank our newest patrons of the show. We have Thomas with a pledge edit and Zeno with another pledge edit. Thank you both very much. And new patrons, Egon Bowman, or something to that effect. I may have thanked George Nash last episode, but once again, thank you, George Nash. And of course, the Odd Atheist Friends podcast. Now, I should say this, I don't think I've ever said this before. If you want to use Patreon as an opportunity to plug a project you're working on, or, your podcast or whatever, you're more than welcome to. And I will use this opportunity to plug Odd Atheist Friends podcast and let all the listeners know that I did appear on the Odd Atheist Friends podcast. And at the time that this episode airs, I don't think they actually have that episode up right now. That will probably be coming out on Wednesday, August 9th. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's what they said. But yeah, longtime listener of the show, Matthew Maxon, invited me on, and we had a very interesting bit of conversation, first talking about politics, and then, of course, evolving into my specialty, Mormonism. So yes, be sure to go listen to that. That will be appearing within the next few days here. And of course, thank you so much to all of those supporters on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. With that, let's shut things down for the night. Of course, I need to thank a few people. I need to thank Demonista as well as Julie for running the Facebook and Twitter pages, and they keep the conversation going there. One real quick heads up, I did just create a private Facebook group to discuss the Smith entheogen theory. If you do want to be a part of that group, we have, I think it's 44 members right now. Find me on Facebook, send me a friend request with a message saying that you want to join that group, and I'll get you added in. We have, I'm officially the moderator of the group, making sure that the people that do join, they're actually people and not bots. And, it's a place that if you want to talk about the Smith entheogen theory without your friends, family, and coworkers seeing your posts about Joseph Smith using drugs, that's a place to do it. So, if you want to be a part of that, just send me a request and a private message. Anyway, I need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork in the show used with his permission. Be sure to go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing music that's going into your ear holes right now. Go to aloststateofmind.com to listen to and download all of his music there. Legal services for this podcast are provided by the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. Listen to Opening Arguments podcast to listen to Thomas and Andrew take on atheist and skeptical law topics. Really fun and informative show over there. This show would be nothing without the patron supporters. So once again, thank you all so much, but the show would have nothing but me shouting into the void if not for all of you amazing listeners out there. So thank you most of all to you once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. So hang on, tell me a little bit more. So Steve Young, you're saying that he essentially has won the hearts of the Marie Osmond has won the hearts of the baby boomers, and
well, look, both of them. I mean, Marie Osmond definitely appeals to the baby boomer generation, right? I mean,
my parents are going to see them this week.
Yeah, and my parents, also, and people of their age, and younger people go and see them too. I mean, I've actually been to their show here in Las Vegas. So, but I mean, I think the music mostly resonates with those of the baby boomer generation, and Steve Young definitely crosses across multiple generations. But I mean, he is on the younger end of the baby boomer generation, and obviously he was at BYU as the younger baby boomers were sort of entering into adulthood, maybe post mission life, and at the height of their sort of BYU fanaticism, and they obviously followed his career as he played in the NFL and all that kind of stuff. So both, I see both of them, and I know that there's other Mormon celebrities that fit that mold too, but I just sort of see both of them as great examples of Mormon celebrities that really speak to baby boomers.
Yeah.
And you get other celebrities like Dan Reynolds, who's the lead singer of Imagine Dragons, and then you have Tyler Glenn, the lead singer of Imagine Dragons, who have both sort of come out in support of LGBT issues and things like this, and they resonate greatly with people. But I don't get the impression, just by my observations, that the older baby boomer generation really even cares who those people are, and can really dismiss them a lot easier than I think they could somebody of a status of like a Steve Young or a Marie Osmond, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get where the need to appeal to that older generation is, because they're kind of on the cusp. I mean, we're not going to win over the bigotry of the octogenarians, but the generation underneath them right now.
Yeah,
I mean, they still are within malleability, right? Mentally, we're able to mentally need them to a certain extent to get them to a point where they might be more accepting of the LGBTQ community. And those people are going to be in leadership positions sooner than anybody that are millennials right now, or of Generation X or anything. So,
well, exactly. And I don't know.
I see the reasoning.
Yeah, and I don't really know what the official sort of cutoff of baby boomers are, but let's just say it's like late 50s, early 60s. I mean, we're looking at another 25, 30 years of their influence in Mormonism. And so I really do think, everybody talks about what the path for change is. And to me, the path for change with anything like LGBT issues is the demands of the people. And the church is not going to acquiesce to intellectual discussion, or probably not even, other outside pressures, but when the people within began to demand it. But, unless you sway the hearts and minds of the baby boomers, I just don't see much progress being made. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, this is one man's opinion, right?
Well, and why? So, in your opinion, why do you think you received any blowback from this open letter?
I think it was probably seen as maybe like a personal attack against them, and I can respect that point of view. I can kind of see where people might be coming from on that. Obviously I called them out by name in the title and in the letter, and I meant what I said to them. But at the same time, I did try to convey the idea that I was really talking to what they represent. In other words, to any kind of Mormon celebrity that has any credibility within that older generation. And I did publish about midday today a follow-up post where I kind of gave an apology for my maybe lack of articulation, and I gave some credit where credit was due, as far as maybe I sold the Youngs a little short on their involvement in the LGBT community, but at the same time I tried to sort of expound on what my larger point was, and I also recognize that me going online and sort of putting them on blast is somewhat unfair, because I'm sort of making these demands of hey, you've got to prove your LGBT street cred to me on my terms, right? And I,
Yeah, right.
I mean, I recognize that that's like inherently unfair because they can do whatever it is they want with their lives and they owe me no explanation.
Right.
But having said that, it's still a feeling that has been nagging me since Sunstone. When I was thinking about, there were multiple panels that discussed LGBT issues, and I attended at least one of them, and I just was thinking about like how does progress take the next step forward within Mormonism, and I mean while there still is room for improvement within the support structure, I do think we're doing a really good job of providing support for people in this community, and I just feel where we're lacking is sort of standing up to the bigotry and homophobia that has permeated every corner of current Mormonism, current day LDS, Mormonism, and sort of speaking truth to that power. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe I was over the top. I don't know. I didn't mean to be insulting to them, and I don't know if they read it or not. I mean, if they did, I hope they didn't take any of it personally, and I hope they also realized that, as I said in my follow up, I'm talking about what I would love to see in a perfect world, but of course, there's no perfect solution to any of this.
Yeah, of course. I was, I'll just share this with you, Ryan. I was in a conversation with some loved ones just after Sunstone here in Utah, and we got into a discussion about the church's stances on the LGBTQ community because it's a fascinating topic of conversation that I really, kind of enjoy engaging with, because obviously it's a highly nuanced topic that there's a lot of folds and corners to investigate in the discussion. But these people were alive and members of the church during the time, the 1978 change on the race and the priesthood. And I asked them, how did they feel when the church came out with the release that they were going to, give the priesthood to all men of all races and colors, so on and so forth. And they said they were both so relieved at it.
Right.
And I couldn't help but see the parallels between it, because that was a tenet that was held over in the church from their parents, right? From the people, a generation and two older than them, that their politics and their understanding of reality had influenced church policy for so long. Finally, in 1978 comes along, the social pressures become too much, and the church has to make a change. I see the church being in the same state right now. And when they do finally get to the point where they can no longer dig their heels in and continue to be bigoted against the LGBTQ community, I have a feeling like it's going to be widely received as a good thing by the majority of members. There are always going to be the holdouts, but I feel like a lot of people are going to be just as relieved about them, giving the priesthood to everybody, because that's kind of what this entails, as people were relieved when they finally gave the priesthood to African Americans.
Well, and look, I agree with everything you said there. I would like to just sort of add a few thoughts to that, because yes, there are a lot of parallels, but I do think that there's a lot of key differences. And if it's true that there's a massive amount of people out there that are going to give a sigh of relief, which I agree there probably are, I feel like that they need to be able to realize that the sense of urgency is on a whole nother level. Because as bad as the racism was, and I don't want to minimize the racism that occurred prior to 1978 in any way, shape, or form, okay? There's absolutely no softening of it. Whatever horrible things happened, they happened, and they should have never happened. But people were not being... There wasn't black babies being born into white families every day in Mormonism that then had to deal with that struggle until 1978 finally came around. As opposed to the LGBT issue, every single day there are people who are going to be part of that community being born into Mormonism every single day around the entire world. And every one of those people is having struggles to different degrees. Some which we know lead up to and including suicide. But even short of suicide, if we don't even have to talk about suicide, there's a homeless there's a homeless epidemic revolving around the LGBT community in Utah that is directly tied to people kicking their LGBT children out of the home. And there's a sense of urgency. And to me, like, I mean, look, I get that it's not easy to, stand up and say something to somebody, I'm not saying that people have to do it in order to be good people, but I just feel like waiting to be able to give that sigh of relief, to me, it just isn't enough. And I mean, I hope, and I do think that people like Steve Young and Marie Osmond could help push that needle a little bit.
Exactly.
That was all I was.
Public figures.
Yeah, that's all I was trying to say. Like, I don't think for one second that the Q15, as they're often referred to in the ex-Mormon community, the top 15 guys, I don't think they're gonna care one little bit what Marie Osmond or Steve Young say. They're not even gonna listen to them. But you know what? But if they if they can get a number of a significant number of the commoners, if you will, out there starting to say, maybe there is something to this. Now all of a sudden they have to listen. Now they have to say, okay, what is Steve Young talking about? What is Marie Osmond talking about? Like, what I meant by saying they're not going to listen to him. Like, look, I'm glad that Steve Young and his wife go to all these support groups. I mean, I don't want them to stop that at all. I hope they keep doing that. But you think that the 15 guys on the top care about that? They could care less.
Well, I think that they could take notice if the Youngs and the Osmonds do. So people pay attention to celebrities, right? And people tend to stupidly follow celebrities thinking that they have some level of authoritative understanding of any given social topic, when by and large, celebrities are vastly undereducated in, current social issues.
Well, and they're just regular people. They're just regular people, right?
They're just regular people, right? They're not... Yes. So that being said, I think if enough people pay attention to celebrities if these celebrities do take a hardline stance against the church for, anything LGBTQ related or not, if enough people kind of rally behind these celebrities, whether, that's a good idea or a bad idea, I think the church can't help but take notice of this. I mean, especially if those celebrities are contributing millions of dollars per year to tithing, and they stand to lose that amount of income.
No, I agree. And again, I want to reiterate, I say all these things completely recognizing that it is somewhat unfair for me to put that burden on these people. Okay. So, and I'm not suggesting that they are bad people if they don't do everything exactly the way I'm saying that they should do it. But I was just daydreaming, and I put that daydream down on paper of what, of what could be, and of what I think could have a real impact. And I think, and one of the things I wrote in there, and I actually talked about this in my Sunstone presentations, we were all taught, everybody who grew up in the LDS church, probably no matter how old you are, we were all taught to do the right thing and let the consequences follow. And if
right.
and if one of the things holding them back, and I don't know if it is or not, but if one of their things holding them back is the fear of the reaction they are going to get from some of the hardliners, I would just hope that that's not the reason that they're holding back, and that it's other reasons, and that would never be a reason to stop them from doing the right thing and speaking out in support of truth and what is right. So anyway, that's the end of my soapbox, I guess.
Well, I'm gonna have to read this. You said it just went up today, right?
Yeah. Well, the first one went up late last night, and then it started getting read today, and I started getting and by the way, the people that pushed back on it, like, I totally appreciate it, and I did gain some additional sort of perspective, and I sort of saw kind of where I wish I would have worded things differently, or maybe where I was a little bit wrong on part of what I said, but so I'm happy for the pushback, but the pushback did lead me to write a pretty quick follow up that I published around midday today. But I'll send you the links to them, and you can read them and see what you think.
I think I'm looking at them right now on Medium.com. Open letter to Steve Young, Marie Osmond et al. I'll have to give that a peruse.
Yeah, and then at the top, I think I put a link to the follow up. So
awesome. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.